They said she was the plain one, the quiet one, the daughter who blended into the wallpaper while her two older sisters commanded every room they entered. For 22 years, Clara Whitfield did the cooking, the mending, the milking, the scrubbing, every invisible task that kept the Whitfield household standing. And not once did her father so much as nod in her direction. So when the wealthiest rancher in the Bitterroot Valley rode up to their front porch and told her father he wanted Clara, not Adelaide, not Josephine, but Clara, the forgotten daughter, well, nobody in that house knew what to say. And what happened next changed everything. If you think you know where this story is going, I promise you, you don't. Like this. Leave a comment and stay until the very end. Now, let's begin. The morning it all fell apart started like every other morning Clara Whitfield had ever known. She was up before dawn, her bare feet on the cold pine floor, her hands already reaching for the apron she'd hung on the nail by the door. October in the Bitterroot Valley meant frost on the windows and ice in the wash basin, and Clara cracked the thin layer with her knuckles before splashing her face. She didn't flinch. She never flinched. That was the thing about Clara. She'd trained herself out of flinching years ago, because flinching meant someone might notice, and being noticed in the Whitfield house was never a good thing. The kitchen was her domain by default. Her mother had died when Clara was 9, and her father, Horace Whitfield, had looked at his 3 daughters and assigned roles the way a man assigns tasks to livestock. Adelaide, the eldest at 26, was the beauty. She would marry well. Josephine, 24, was the clever one. She would manage the social connections, the church committees, the careful web of favors that kept a family respectable in a small town. And Clara, the youngest, 12 at the time. Clara would do everything else. That was it. 12 years old and handed the full weight of a household. She didn't complain. There was no one to complain to. Her father wasn't cruel in the way that leaves marks. He was cruel in the way that leaves silence. He simply never spoke to her unless something was wrong. The bread was too dense. The stove had gone cold. The chickens had gotten into the garden again. Clara existed in his peripheral vision, a function rather than a person. And over the years, she'd come to accept that this was her shape in the world. Useful, invisible, permanent. But that October morning, something shifted. She heard her father's voice in the parlor before she'd even gotten the coffee on. That was unusual. Horace Whitfield was a man of rigid habits, and he did not entertain visitors before breakfast. Clara paused at the kitchen doorway, a cast iron pot in her hand, and listened. "I won't hear of it," her father was saying. His voice had that particular edge, the one he used when money was involved. "You can't just ride in here and make demands." "I'm not making demands." The second voice was unfamiliar, low, unhurried, with a kind of gravel in it that suggested the man either didn't talk much or talked too much in cold air. "I'm making an offer. There's a difference." The answer is no. "You haven't heard the terms." Clara set the pot down quietly and moved closer to the doorway. Through the crack in the hinges, she could see her father standing with his arms crossed, his face the color of old brick. Across from him stood a man she'd never seen before, tall, broad through the shoulders, wearing a dark coat that had seen weather and work in equal measure. His hat was in his hands, which struck her as oddly polite given the tension in the room. He had a face that looked like it had been carved from hardwood and then left out in the rain. Not handsome exactly, but solid, real. "Mr. Whitfield," the stranger said, "I'll be direct. I need a wife. I've got 1,200 acres, 400 head of cattle, and a house with no one in it. I'm not looking for decoration. I'm looking for someone who can work, who can think, and who won't fall apart the first time a storm takes the roof off the barn." Her father let out a sharp laugh. "Then you'll want to speak to Adelaide. She's the— I'm not here for Adelaide." Silence. "Josephine, then. She's— I'm not here for Josephine either." Clara's hand tightened on the doorframe. "I'm here for Clara." The silence that followed was so complete Clara could hear the clock on the mantel ticking, could hear the wind pressing against the window panes, could hear her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. Her father's face went through several expressions: confusion, irritation, something that might have been amusement if it hadn't been so dismissive. "Clara," he repeated, as if the stranger had asked for the barn cat. "Clara. You don't want Clara." "I believe I just said I did." She's not." Her father waved a hand vaguely, the gesture encompassing everything he'd never bothered to articulate about his youngest daughter. "Not pretty enough, not polished enough, not worth enough. She's not suited for— she wouldn't know how to— She runs this household, doesn't she?" Her father blinked. "So the cooking, the cleaning, the garden, the chickens, the mending, the preserving, that's all Clara, isn't it? Your other two daughters don't lift a finger from what I've heard, and I've heard plenty." The stranger's voice was calm, factual, almost clinical. "I don't need a woman who can play piano and make conversation at a church social. I need a woman who can keep a ranch alive through a Montana winter. Everything I've been told says that's Clara." Horace Whitfield stared at the man for a long moment, and then he did something that Clara would never forget, something that would burn in her chest for the rest of her life. He shrugged. He just shrugged, like someone had offered to buy an old plow horse he had no use for. "Take her then," he said. "She's yours if she'll go." No negotiation, no hesitation, no fatherly concern about who this man was, what his intentions were, whether Clara would be safe or happy or loved. Just take her, like handing off a sack of flour. Clara stepped back from the doorway. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear, not from excitement, from rage. Pure, white-hot, clarifying rage. 22 years. 22 years of waking before dawn, of scrubbing floors until her knuckles bled, of cooking meals she was never thanked for, of sitting silent at a table where no one asked her opinion or noticed her absence. 22 years, and her father's final word on her value was a shrug. She walked back to the kitchen. She put the coffee on. She made breakfast. She served it to her father and her sisters without a word, and when Adelaide asked why she looked pale, Clara said, "I'm fine," because that's what she always said, and no one ever pressed further. It was Josephine who brought it up at the table because Josephine always knew things. She had a way of collecting information like other women collected buttons, quietly, compulsively, with an eye toward future use. "I heard Father had a visitor this morning," Josephine said, buttering her bread with precise strokes. "A Mr. Calloway. Elias Calloway." She let the name sit in the air like a dropped coin. Adelaide looked up. "Calloway? The Calloway? The one who owns the biggest ranch in the valley, yes. 1,200 acres. Maybe more. They say he's worth more than the bank." Josephine's eyes slid to Clara. "They say he asked for you." The table went quiet. Adelaide set down her fork. She looked at Clara the way you'd look at a dog that had suddenly started speaking French. Not angry, exactly, but deeply, fundamentally confused. "For you?" Adelaide said. "Apparently," Clara said. That's, that can't be right. He must have meant, he meant me. Adelaide looked at Josephine. Josephine looked at Adelaide. Something passed between them. A silent conversation Clara had watched them have 1,000 times. A language of raised eyebrows and tilted heads that she had never been invited to learn. "Well," Adelaide said finally, with a little laugh that was meant to be kind but landed like a slap. "I'm sure it's some sort of misunderstanding. A man like Elias Calloway doesn't just— I mean, no offense, Clara, but you're not exactly— Not exactly what?" Adelaide faltered. She wasn't accustomed to Clara pushing back. None of them were. "I just mean," Adelaide said carefully, "a man of his standing would typically look for someone more like you," Clara said. The silence at that table could have frozen the river. Clara stood up. She gathered the plates. Because of course she gathered the plates. That's what she did. That's all she'd ever done. And she carried them to the kitchen, and she washed them in water so hot it turned her hands red. And she thought about a man with a gravel voice who had walked into her father's parlor and said her name like it meant something. She found Elias Calloway on the front porch an hour later. He was leaning against the railing, watching the valley below with the patience of a man who was used to waiting for things, for calves to be born, for storms to pass, for grass to grow. He turned when the door opened, and Clara got her first real look at him in full daylight. He was older than her, maybe 35, with lines around his eyes that came from squinting into sun and wind. His hands were rough, his jaw was set, and his eyes were the color of creek water in November, gray-green and hard to read. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "Miss Whitfield, I heard your conversation with my father." He didn't look embarrassed. He didn't look anything, really. "Then you know what I'm offering." "I know what you're offering. I don't know why." He studied her for a moment. Not the way men usually looked at Adelaide, with hunger or admiration. He looked at Clara the way a man looks at a piece of land he's considering buying, assessing, measuring, trying to determine what it could yield. "I told your father the truth," he said. "I need someone who can work. I asked around town. Every person I talked to said the same thing. Clara Whitfield is the one who holds that family together. The one who works from dark to dark without complaint. The one nobody notices until she's gone." He paused. "I notice things other people don't. That's how I got 1,200 acres. This isn't a cattle purchase, Mr. Calloway. No, it isn't. It's a partnership. I'm offering you a legal marriage, a house of your own, land that'll be half yours by law, and work that'll be harder than anything you've done here. But work that'll be yours. Not your father's. Not your sister's. Yours." Clara looked out at the valley. The aspens were turning gold, and the mountains beyond were already capped with snow. She thought about the kitchen she'd scrubbed 10,000 times. She thought about her father's shrug. She thought about Adelaide's little laugh. "I won't pretend to love you," he said. "I won't pretend this is something it isn't. But I'll be honest with you. I'll be fair with you. And I'll never make you feel like you don't matter. That's more than you've got now." It was the most brutal, honest, unromantic proposal a woman had ever received. And it was the first time in Clara's life that someone had looked at her, really looked at her, and seen something worth choosing. "When do we leave?" she said. He blinked. That was the only surprise she ever saw on his face. One blink, like he'd expected her to argue, to hesitate, to ask for time. But Clara Whitfield had spent 22 years waiting, and she was done. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "First light." "I'll be ready." She packed that night. Everything she owned fit into one carpet bag. 22 years of life, and it all fit into a single bag with room to spare. 2 dresses, a wool shawl, her mother's Bible, a hairbrush with a cracked handle, and a pair of boots she'd resoled twice. That was it. That was everything Clara Whitfield had to show for 2 decades of relentless, invisible labor. She didn't cry. She set the bag by the door, and she went to bed. And she lay in the dark, listening to the house settle around her. The house she'd kept standing with her bare hands. And she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Maybe ever. She felt chosen. The ride to Calloway's ranch took the better part of a day. They traveled in his wagon, a sturdy buckboard pulled by 2 draft horses that moved with the calm certainty of animals who knew exactly where they were going. Clara sat on the bench beside Elias, her carpet bag at her feet, and for the first 2 hours, neither of them said a word. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of 2 people who hadn't yet figured out the shape of each other, who were still measuring the distance between what they'd agreed to and what it actually felt like to be sitting side by side on a wagon seat, heading toward a shared life. The valley opened up around them as they climbed. Wider, greener, more vast than anything Clara had seen from her father's porch. The Bitterroot River threaded through the bottom like a silver ribbon, and the mountains on either side rose up in dark ranks of pine and granite. It was beautiful in a way that made Clara's chest ache, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Maybe because beauty had never been something she was allowed to stop and notice. There was always something to scrub, something to mend, something to cook. "The house needs work," Elias said, breaking the silence so suddenly that Clara startled. "I'm telling you now so you don't think I lied to you. I didn't expect a palace." "Good. Because it's not one." He paused. "The roof leaks in the back bedroom. The stove works, but the flue sticks. The porch steps are rotted on the left side. I've been meaning to fix them for 2 years." 2 years? "I've been busy." Clara almost smiled. Almost. "What about the ranch itself?" 400 head, like I said. Spring calving starts in March. I've got a foreman, Hank Dawson, good man, been with me since the beginning. A hand named Thomas, who's young and green but works hard. And a cook who quit last month, because he said the isolation was making him hear voices. Elias glanced at her. "It is isolated. I won't pretend otherwise. The nearest town is 2 hours by wagon. The nearest neighbor is 6 miles. In winter, when the snow comes, you won't see another soul for weeks. I've been invisible my whole life, Mr. Calloway. Isolation doesn't scare me." He looked at her then, a long, measuring look that she held without blinking. Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, exactly, but recognition. Like he'd just confirmed something he'd suspected. "She would call me Elias," he said. "If we're going to be married, you might as well use my name." They arrived at the ranch in late afternoon, when the sun was sitting low and orange on the western ridge. The house was exactly as he'd described. A 2-story log structure with a wide porch, a leaking roof, and rotted steps. But it was solid. The bones were good. Clara could see that immediately. The way she could look at a sack of flour and know whether it was fresh. The way she could press her thumb into bread dough and know whether it needed more time. She had an eye for things that could be saved. Hank Dawson was waiting on the porch. He was a man of about 50, bow-legged and sun-cured, with a mustache that looked like it had been borrowed from a walrus. He looked at Clara the way you'd look at a new piece of equipment. Curious, but skeptical. "This her?" he said. "This is her," Elias said. "She's smaller than I expected." "She's standing right here," Clara said. Hank's eyebrows went up. Then he grinned. A slow, surprised grin that cracked his weathered face wide open. "Well, all right then," he said, and tipped his hat. The wedding was 3 days later, performed by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through on his way to Missoula. It took place in the front room of the ranch house, with Hank and Thomas as witnesses. Thomas was a boy of maybe 19, Mexican-born, with dark eyes and a shy smile, and he held his hat over his heart during the ceremony like he was at a funeral. The preacher read the vows. Elias said, "I do," the way a man confirms a livestock order. Clara said, "I do," the way a woman steps off a cliff, with her eyes open and her jaw set. There was no kiss. Elias looked at her after the preacher pronounced them married, and he gave her a single nod. And that was that. Clara Calloway. She turned the name over in her mind like a stone in her palm. It didn't feel real yet, but it felt possible. That night, Elias showed her to the back bedroom, the one with the leaking roof. He'd put a bucket under the drip and a quilt on the bed that smelled like cedar and dust. "This is your room," he said. "Mine's across the hall. I don't expect." He stopped, and for the first time, Clara saw something almost human flicker across his face. Discomfort, awkwardness, the stumbling uncertainty of a man who had planned everything except this part. "This is a partnership," he said finally. "Not a, I won't come to your door uninvited. You have my word." "Thank you," Clara said, and she meant it more than he probably knew. He nodded and left, pulling the door shut behind him, and Clara sat on the edge of the bed in her new room, in her new house, on her new husband's ranch. And she pressed her hands flat against the quilt, and she breathed. The next morning, she got up before dawn. Old habits. She found the kitchen, assessed the stove. He was right. The flue stuck. But she worked it loose with a poker and a few sharp words she'd learned from the stable hand back home. And by the time Elias came downstairs, there was coffee on the table, eggs in the skillet, and biscuits in the oven. He stood in the kitchen doorway and stared at the table like it was a foreign landscape. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "I know. I can cook for myself." "Can you?" He paused. "After a fashion." "Sit down, Elias." He sat. He ate. He didn't say thank you, but he ate every bite, and when he was done, he looked at her across the table with that same assessing gaze, and he said, "The calves need checking in the south pasture. You ride?" "I ride." "Then come with me." That was how it began. Not with romance, not with tenderness, not with any of the things the novels Adelaide used to read by lamplight promised. It began with work, hard, honest, unglamorous work that started before sunrise and didn't end until the stars were out. Clara learned the ranch the way she'd learned her father's household, by doing everything no one else wanted to do, and doing it better than anyone expected. The first week, she rode out with Elias every morning to check the herd. She learned to read the cattle, which ones were healthy, which ones were lagging, which ones were likely to calve early. She learned the land, too, where the creek crossings were, where the fence lines needed mending, where the wolves came down from the ridgeline in winter. Elias taught her in his particular way, which was to say he pointed at things and grunted, and Clara translated the grunts into knowledge. By the second week, she'd taken over the kitchen garden, which had gone to ruin since the cook left. She cleared the weeds, turned the soil, and planted late-season greens that she covered with burlap against the frost. Hank watched her from the bunkhouse porch, shaking his head. "She's going to kill herself working like that," he told Elias. "She's been working like that her whole life," Elias said. Difference is, now it's for herself. By the third week, Clara had fixed the porch steps. She'd found lumber in the barn, a saw, a hammer, and nails, and she'd done it herself on a Tuesday afternoon while Elias was out riding the fence line. When he came home and saw the new steps, he stopped his horse and stared at them for a full 30 seconds. "You did this," he said. "The left side was rotted. You said so yourself." "I said I'd been meaning to fix them for 2 years." "Well," Clara said, wiping her hands on her apron, "now you don't have to." Something happened in his face then. A crack in the granite. Not a smile. Elias Calloway didn't smile, not yet. But something adjacent to one. A softening around the eyes. A loosening of the jaw. He looked at her, and for just a moment, he didn't look like a man who had purchased a partnership. He looked like a man who was beginning to realize he'd gotten far more than he'd bargained for. Thomas was the first to say it out loud. They were mending fence in the north pasture, Clara holding the wire taut while Thomas hammered the staples, and he said, quiet and earnest, "Senora Calloway, I think you are the hardest working person I have ever seen." "You haven't been alive very long, Thomas," he laughed. "Long enough to know. My mother was like you. She could do anything. My father used to say she was the spine of the family. Everyone else was just the ribs." Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest. Not pride, exactly. Recognition. The recognition of being seen by someone who understood what it meant to be the spine. The pivotal moment came in the 4th week, when a late October storm rolled in faster than anyone expected. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours, and the wind came screaming down from the mountains like something alive and angry. Elias and Hank were out with the herd, trying to drive the cattle toward the sheltered draw on the south end of the property. Tomas was in the barn, securing the horses, and Clara was in the house when she heard it. A sound like a gunshot, followed by a crash that shook the walls. She ran outside. The wind nearly knocked her flat. Through the driving snow, she could see that the barn door had blown off its top hinge and was swinging wildly, slamming against the frame. The horses inside were screaming. Tomas was trying to hold the door, but he was a lean boy fighting a force of nature, and he was losing. Clara didn't think. She grabbed a rope from the porch rail, ran to the barn, and together with Thomas, she lashed the door to the frame. The wind fought them. The rope burned her palms. The cold was so fierce it felt like being slapped by God. But she held on. She held on until the rope was secure, until the door was steady, until the horses calmed. When Elias rode in 2 hours later, ice in his beard and exhaustion in every line of his body, Hank told him what had happened. Elias found Clara in the kitchen, her hands wrapped in strips of cloth where the rope had torn the skin, calmly making soup like she hadn't just saved his barn and his horses in the middle of a blizzard. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her hands. He looked at her face. And he said, in a voice so quiet she almost didn't hear it over the wind still howling outside, "Thank you, Clara." It was the first time he'd said her name like that. Not as a fact, not as a label, but as something he was grateful to know. She nodded. "Soup's almost ready," she said, and that was the night everything began to change between them, not because of what was said, but because of what was understood. Clara Calloway was not a convenience. She was not a function. She was the spine of this ranch, and everyone under its roof knew it. But knowing it and saying it were two different things, and the peace Clara had begun to build was about to be shattered. Because 3 weeks after the storm, a carriage pulled up to the ranch house. A fine carriage, black and polished, completely wrong for the rutted mountain road it had just traveled. And out of that carriage stepped Adelaide Whitfield, wearing a dress that cost more than everything Clara owned, with a smile on her face that Clara recognized immediately. It was the smile Adelaide wore when she wanted something that belonged to someone else. Delayed didn't come alone. That was the first thing Clara noticed. Behind the fine carriage came a second wagon, and in it sat Horace Whitfield himself, dressed in his Sunday coat, despite it being a Wednesday, his face arranged in the particular expression of fatherly concern he wore when money was at stake. Josephine sat beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes already cataloging every detail of the ranch, the size of the house, the number of cattle visible on the hillside, the quality of the fencing. Clara watched them from the kitchen window and felt something cold settle in her stomach. Not fear, dread. The specific dread of someone who knows exactly how a certain kind of person operates. "Company," Hank said from behind her, peering over her shoulder. "Friends of yours?" "Family," Clara said, and the word tasted like ash. She met them on the porch with the steps she'd fixed herself, which felt suddenly important. Adelaide came up first, her skirts gathered delicately, her eyes sweeping the property with barely concealed calculation. "Clara," she said, and kissed the air beside Clara's cheek. "You look, well, thinner." "I look fine, Adelaide." "Of course you do. We've been so worried. Father insisted we come check on you. It's been weeks and not a single letter." "I've been busy." "Busy?" Adelaide smiled. That smile. "Yes, I can see that. It's very rustic, isn't it?" She looked at the house the way you'd look at a stain on a tablecloth. "Is your husband home?" "He's out with the herd." "Pity. I was so hoping to meet him properly. We didn't get much of a chance, what with everything happening so fast." Adelaide's voice carried a note of practiced innocence that Clara knew like she knew her own heartbeat. "Father has some concerns, legal concerns, about the marriage." There it was. Clara felt the cold in her stomach harden into something sharper. "What kind of legal concerns?" Horace Whitfield climbed the porch steps slowly, leaning on a cane Clara had never seen before. A prop, she realized, designed to make him look frail and sympathetic. He looked at her with an expression that might have passed for tenderness if you didn't know him. "Clara, my girl," he said, and the words were so foreign in his mouth that Clara almost laughed. He had never once called her his girl. "I've been talking to Judge Patterson in town. He believes the marriage may not be entirely proper. You're young, there was no courtship, no banns posted, and frankly, a man of Calloway's means pursuing a girl of your situation. It raises questions." "What questions?" "Questions of coercion, exploitation." Horace's voice was smooth, rehearsed. "A wealthy man, an unprotected young woman, a hasty ceremony with no family present. Patterson says he could review the validity of the union. For your protection, of course." Of course. Everything Horace Whitfield did was for someone's protection, usually his own. Clara looked at her father. She looked at Adelaide, whose eyes were bright with poorly concealed ambition. She looked at Josephine, who had the decency to look slightly uncomfortable, and she understood, with a clarity that felt like sunlight breaking through cloud, exactly what was happening. They didn't want her back. They wanted what she had. They wanted the ranch, the land, the wealth. They wanted Elias Calloway, and they wanted him attached to a daughter who would keep the family's interests at the center of everything. Adelaide wanted a wealthy husband. Horace wanted a wealthy son-in-law he could leverage, and Clara was simply in the way. Again. You should stay for supper, Clara said calmly. Elias will want to hear this himself. She cooked for them because that's what she did. Because even now, even standing in her own kitchen, in her own house, the muscle memory of service was hard to override. But something was different this time. She cooked because she chose to. She set the table with 4 places and didn't set a 5th for herself until Hank appeared in the doorway and said, "You're eating too, Senora. Sit down." And she did. Elias came in at dusk, snow on his shoulders, his face wind-raw. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the visitors. His eyes moved from Horace to Adelaide to Josephine, and then to Clara. And something passed between them, a question and an answer, delivered in silence. The way 2 people communicate when they've spent weeks working side by side in weather that doesn't allow for wasted words. "Mr. Calloway," Horace began, rising from his chair with his prop cane. "We need to discuss." "Sit down," Elias said. Not rudely, just factually, the way you'd tell a horse to stand. Horace sat. Elias hung his coat, washed his hands in the basin, and took his place at the head of the table. He looked at the food Clara had made, roast venison, potatoes, biscuits, gravy, and he looked at her, and he said, "Thank you, Clara." Just like that, in front of all of them. 2 words that contained more recognition than her father had given her in 22 years. Then he turned to Horace. "Say your piece." Horace launched into his rehearsed speech about legal concerns and judicial review and the protection of vulnerable young women. Elias listened without expression. Adelaide added her own commentary. How worried they'd all been. How unusual the arrangement was. How people in town were talking. Josephine said nothing, but her eyes moved between Clara and Elias like she was reading a language she hadn't expected to find. When they finished, Elias was quiet for a long moment. Then he spoke, and his voice was the voice of a man who had built an empire out of dirt and patience and sheer, unrelenting will. "Your daughter is my wife," he said. "Legally, before God and witnesses. Judge Patterson can review whatever he likes. He'll find a valid marriage performed by an ordained minister with 2 witnesses of legal age. I know, because I made sure of it." He looked at Horace. "You gave your consent. I have witnesses to that too. So if you're here to take her back, you're wasting your time. And if you're here to take what's hers, you're wasting mine." Adelaide's smile faltered. Horace's face went the color of old brick, that same shade Clara remembered from the morning this all began. "Now," Elias said, picking up his fork, "eat your supper or don't. But this conversation is over." They left the next morning. Adelaide didn't kiss the air beside Clara's cheek on the way out. Horace didn't call her his girl. Josephine paused at the bottom of the porch steps, the steps Clara had fixed, and looked back. "He sees you," Josephine said quietly. "I'm glad someone finally does." It was the kindest thing a Whitfield had ever said to Clara, and it came from the sister she'd expected it from least. That night, after the house was quiet and the lamps were low, Clara sat on the porch wrapped in her wool shawl, looking at the stars. The valley was so dark and so vast that the sky seemed infinite, a spill of light so dense it looked like someone had scattered flour across black cloth. She heard the door open behind her and felt rather than saw Elias settle into the chair beside hers. They sat in silence for a long time. That was their way. Silence first, then words, if words were needed. The silence between them had changed over the weeks. It used to be the silence of strangers. Now it was the silence of 2 people who trusted each other enough not to fill every moment with noise. I should tell you something, Elias said finally. His voice was different, quieter, stripped of the authority he wore like armor. About why I live the way I do, why the house was empty, why I came looking for what I came looking for. Clara waited. She didn't prompt him. She'd learned that Elias spoke when he was ready and not a moment before, and pushing him was like pushing a river, pointless and likely to get you wet. I was married before, he said. Her name was Ruth. We married young. I was 22, she was 19. We built this place together. She was everything good about this ranch. The garden was hers. The curtains in the front room, the ones that are falling apart now, she made those. She made this place a home. He paused. The wind moved through the pines, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called. She died in childbirth, he said. The baby, too. A boy. I'd already picked a name. Samuel, after my father. His hands were clasped between his knees, and Clara could see them tightening, the knuckles going white. That was 7 years ago. I closed the door on that part of myself. Told myself I didn't need it. Told myself the ranch was enough. And for a while it was. What changed? He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then, I got tired of eating alone. The simplicity of it broke something open in Clara's chest. Not pity, she knew better than to offer him that, but understanding. Deep, bone-level understanding of what it meant to be surrounded by emptiness, and to keep going anyway, not because you were brave, but because stopping wasn't an option. And I wasn't looking for a replacement, he said. I want you to know that. Ruth was Ruth. She can't be replaced. I was looking for, I don't know, something real. Someone who wouldn't pretend. Someone who knew what it was like to do hard things alone and keep standing. He looked at her. That's you, Clara. She reached out and put her hand over his. Just that. No grand gesture, no tearful embrace. Just her hand on his, warm and steady, in the dark. You don't have to eat alone anymore, she said. He turned his hand over and held hers. His grip was rough and careful at the same time, like he was holding something he was afraid of breaking. They sat like that for a long time. Two people who had each built walls so high they'd forgotten there was anything on the other side, sitting together in the dark and letting the walls come down, brick by brick, in silence. The weeks that followed were different, not dramatically. Elias didn't suddenly become a man of poetry and grand romantic gestures, but the edges softened. He started coming in for lunch instead of eating jerky in the saddle. He fixed the flu properly, the one Clara had been fighting with every morning. He brought her a pair of gloves from town, good ones lined with rabbit fur, and left them on the kitchen table without a word. Clara found them and put them on and wore them every day, and neither of them mentioned it, but they both knew what it meant. The first snow came in November, heavy and serious, the kind of snow that seals you in and forces you to reckon with whoever you're sealed in with. Clara and Elias were sealed in together, and what they found was that they fit. Not perfectly. He was still gruff, still awkward, still prone to retreating into silence when emotions got too close. And she was still fierce, still independent, still inclined to do everything herself rather than ask for help. But they fit the way two pieces of weathered wood fit when you press them together. Not smooth, not seamless, but solid, load-bearing. It was during a December thaw that the letter came. Delivered by a rider from town, muddy and half-frozen, the envelope bearing the seal of Judge Patterson's office. Clara's hands went cold when she saw it. She opened it at the kitchen table while Elias watched from the doorway. It was a summons. A formal hearing to review the validity of the Calloway marriage, requested by Horace Whitfield on behalf of his daughter Clara, citing concerns of coercion and undue influence. The hearing was set for January 15th in town, before Judge Patterson and whatever audience chose to attend. Clara read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at Elias. "He's not going to stop," she said. "No," Elias agreed. "He's not. This isn't about protecting me. It's about controlling what I have, what we have. I know." Then we go. We go to that hearing, and we end this. Elias looked at her, and for the first time since she'd known him, he smiled. It was small and brief, barely a flicker, but it was real. A genuine smile from a man who had forgotten how, offered to a woman who had earned it. "We go," he said. The ride to town took 3 hours in the January cold. Clara wore her rabbit fur gloves and her best dress. Her only good dress, actually. The one she'd sewn herself from fabric she'd bought with egg money. It was plain. Dark blue wool, simple lines, no lace or ribbon. But it was hers, made by her own hands, and she wore it like armor. The hearing was held in the town hall, a drafty wooden building that served as courthouse, meeting house, and occasional dance hall. Half the town had turned out, because small towns feed on spectacle. And a wealthy rancher's marriage being challenged by the bride's own father was the most exciting thing to happen since the saloon caught fire last spring. Horace was there, with his prop cane and his rehearsed concern. Adelaide was there, wearing a dress that cost more than Clara's entire wardrobe, her hair pinned in elaborate curls. Josephine was there, standing slightly apart from the others, her expression unreadable. Judge Patterson sat behind a table at the front, a thin man with spectacles and a reputation for being easily influenced by whoever had spoken to him most recently. The judge opened by reading the complaint, that Clara Whitfield, now Calloway, had been coerced into marriage by a man of superior means and position, that the union had been conducted without proper family involvement, and that the young woman's interests had not been adequately protected. Horace spoke first. He was eloquent, concerned, fatherly, everything he had never been in private. He painted a picture of a naive young girl swept away by a powerful man, isolated on a remote ranch, cut off from her loving family. Adelaide nodded along, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Then it was Clara's turn. She stood. The room went quiet. She could feel every eye on her, the townsfolk, the judge, her father, her sisters, and Elias, sitting in the front row with his hat in his hands, watching her with those gray-green eyes that had seen her from the very beginning. "Your Honor," Clara said, and her voice was steady as a fence post. "My father says I was coerced. I'd like to ask him a question." The judge hesitated, then nodded. Clara turned to her father. "When Mr. Calloway came to you and asked for my hand, what did you say?" Horace shifted in his seat. I gave my consent, but under... What exactly did you say? The exact words." Silence. "You said, 'Take her. She's yours if she'll go.'" Clara let the words hang in the air. "You didn't ask if I'd be safe. You didn't ask about his character. You didn't negotiate a single term. You shrugged, and you gave me away like I was a piece of furniture you were tired of dusting." The room was so quiet you could hear the wind outside. "I was not coerced," Clara said. "I was chosen. For the first time in my life, someone looked at me and saw something worth having. Not because I was pretty or clever or connected, but because I was strong, because I worked hard, because I was real." She looked at Adelaide. My sister is here because she wants what I have. My father is here because he wants what my husband has. Neither of them is here because they want me. They have never wanted me. She turned back to the judge. I am Clara Calloway. I am not a child. I am not a victim. I am a woman who chose her life, and I will not let anyone, not my father, not my sister, not this court, take it from me. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from somewhere in the back of the room, Hank Dawson started clapping. Slow, deliberate claps that echoed off the wooden walls. Thomas joined him, then the woman who ran the general store, then the blacksmith, then half the room. Judge Patterson looked at Horace Whitfield. He looked at Adelaide. He looked at Clara, standing straight and unshaking in her plain blue dress, and he dismissed the case. Outside, in the cold January sunlight, Clara stood on the boardwalk and breathed. The air was sharp and clean and tasted like freedom, which, it turned out, tasted a lot like pine sap and snow. Elias came up beside her. He didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, solid and real, the way he always was. Then he reached over and took her hand. Right there, on the main street, in front of God and the general store and anyone who cared to look. You didn't need me in there, he said. No, she agreed. I didn't. That's why I married you. She looked up at him. He was almost smiling again. That small, rare, hard-won expression that she was beginning to understand was worth more than 1,000 easy grins from 1,000 lesser men. Take me home, Elias, she said. He did. The months that followed were the best of Clara's life, though she wouldn't have described them that way at the time. She would have said they were hard. And they were. Calving season nearly broke her. The spring floods took out a section of fence that required 2 weeks of brutal repair, and a mountain lion took 3 calves before Elias tracked it into the high country and dealt with it in the way ranchers dealt with such things. But the hardness was different now. It was shared hardness, chosen hardness, the kind of difficulty that builds something instead of grinding it down. The ranch thrived under their partnership. Clara took over the books. She had a head for numbers that surprised even Elias. And by summer, she'd identified 3 places where they were losing money and 2 where they could gain it. She expanded the kitchen garden into something that could feed the ranch year-round and sell surplus in town. She started a chicken operation that Hank called ridiculous until the egg money paid for new tack for every horse on the property. Elias watched all of this with an expression that had evolved from assessment to admiration to something deeper, something he didn't have a word for, but that Clara could feel every time he looked at her across the supper table. Every time he handed her a cup of coffee in the morning, every time he said her name. Love, it turned out, didn't arrive on horseback with flowers and declarations. It arrived in the form of a man who fixed the flu without being asked. A woman who stayed up all night with a sick calf. 2 people who sat on a porch in the dark and held hands and didn't need to say a single word. In August, a letter arrived from Josephine. Their father was ill. His heart, the doctor said. He might not last the winter. Josephine didn't ask Clara to come home. She just wanted her to know. Clara sat with the letter for a long time. Elias found her on the porch, the paper in her lap, her eyes on the mountains. You going? He asked. I don't know. You don't owe him anything. I know. But you're going. She looked at him. I'm going. Not for him. For me. I need to close that door properly, or it'll stay open forever. He nodded. I'll drive you. They went together. Horace Whitfield was smaller than Clara remembered, shrunken by illness into something that barely resembled the man who had shrugged her away like surplus grain. He was in bed, propped up on pillows, his face the color of candle wax. Adelaide was there, looking exhausted and resentful, because caring for a sick parent was work, and Adelaide had never been built for work. Josephine was there too, steady as always, doing what needed to be done. Clara sat beside her father's bed. He looked at her, and for the first time in her life, she saw something in his eyes that might have been regret, or might have been the morphine. It was hard to tell. "Clara," he said. His voice was a whisper. I should have." "I know," she said. And she did. She knew everything he should have done and hadn't, everything he should have said and didn't, every moment of recognition he'd withheld because she wasn't the daughter he'd wanted her to be. She knew all of it, and she'd carried it for years, and she was tired. "I forgive you," she said. Not because he deserved it, not because he'd asked properly, but because the weight of it was hers, and she was done carrying it. "I forgive you, and I'm going home now." He closed his eyes. She stood up, and she walked out, and she didn't look back. On the ride home, Elias reached over and took her hand on the wagon seat. They rode like that for an hour, in silence, through the golden September valley, and Clara felt the last door close behind her. Gently, firmly, finally. Their first child was born the following spring. A girl. They named her Ruth, after the woman who had built the house, who had hung the curtains, who had planted the first garden. Elias held his daughter in his rough hands and wept. The only time Clara ever saw him cry. And Clara watched him and understood that some doors, when they close, make room for others to open. Hank declared himself the child's honorary grandfather and carved her a wooden horse before she was a week old. Tomas brought wildflowers from the meadow every day for a month. The ranch hands who'd been skeptical of Clara 2 years ago now deferred to her without question, because she had earned every inch of their respect with her hands and her grit and her refusal to be anything less than exactly who she was. Years later, when Ruth was old enough to ask, Clara told her the story. All of it. The kitchen she'd scrubbed 10,000 times, the father who shrugged, the stranger who saw her, the porch steps she'd fixed, the storm she'd survived, the courtroom where she'd stood up and refused to disappear. "Why are you telling me this?" Ruth asked, because she was her mother's daughter, direct, practical, uninterested in sentiment for sentiment's sake. Clara looked at her girl, this fierce small person with her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's stubborn jaw, and she said the thing she'd spent her whole life learning to believe. "Because you should know that your worth isn't decided by the people who overlook you. It's decided by what you do when someone finally sees you, and by what you refuse to accept from those who don't. I was the forgotten daughter. I was invisible for 22 years, and then I wasn't. Not because someone rescued me, because I rescued myself. The man I married didn't save me. He just had the good sense to get out of my way." She wasn't invisible. She wasn't worthless. She wasn't the forgotten daughter. She was Clara Calloway, spine of the ranch, keeper of the books, fixer of porch steps, survivor of storms. And she had built this life, this whole beautiful, hard-won life, with her own 2 hands.